What happens when the future Queen of England finds herself caught between royal duty and human compassion at a charity gala? When a grieving mother's desperate plea collides with centuries of protocol, Catherine, Princess of Wales, must choose between the crown's expectations and her own moral compass. This is the untold story of one evening that would forever change how the royal family approaches their most sacred traditions, and how a single conversation at a London charity event exposed the delicate balance between power, privilege, and genuine humanity. The glittering ballroom fell silent as all eyes turned to the princess, waiting to see if she would enforce the very rules that had shaped her world, or if she would dare to break them for the sake of what was right. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Grosvenor House ballroom as Catherine, Princess of Wales, moved gracefully through the crowd of London's elite. Her midnight blue Alexander McQueen gown rustled softly with each measured step, the sapphire and diamond necklace at her throat catching the warm light. To the hundreds of guests at the Children's Hospital Charity Gala, she appeared the perfect picture of royal composure, back straight, smile radiant, every gesture rehearsed to perfection. But beneath the polished exterior, Catherine's mind was elsewhere. Earlier that evening, as she had prepared for the gala in her private chambers at Kensington Palace, her lady-in-waiting had briefed her on the evening's protocol. The list had been extensive: which dignitaries to greet first, how long to spend with each major donor, the exact words to use when presenting the charity's annual award. Every minute had been choreographed, every interaction planned down to the smallest detail. Your Royal Highness must remember, her private secretary had emphasized while reviewing the guest list one final time, tonight is about maintaining the dignity of the crown while supporting the charity. The usual protocols apply. No personal conversations that might be misconstrued by the press, no commitments that haven't been pre-approved, and certainly no deviations from the planned remarks. Catherine had nodded dutifully, as she had done countless times before. After more than a decade as a member of the royal family, she understood the delicate dance required at such events. Every word would be scrutinized, every gesture analyzed by both the media and the public. The weight of the crown, even as the wife of the heir apparent, meant that personal feelings often had to be set aside in favor of institutional responsibilities. The evening had begun smoothly enough. Catherine had arrived precisely on schedule, stepping from the royal car with practiced elegance as camera flashes illuminated the red carpet. She had greeted the charity's board members with appropriate warmth, posed for the requisite photographs, and delivered her prepared remarks about the importance of supporting children's health care with exactly the right blend of passion and restraint. As she moved through the reception, Catherine found herself in her element. These gatherings, while demanding, had become second nature to her. She could discuss the charity's work with genuine interest, compliment a donor's contribution with sincere appreciation, and navigate complex conversations about funding and policy with diplomatic skill. The guests responded to her presence with a mixture of reverence and delight, many clearly starstruck by the opportunity to meet the future queen. "Your Royal Highness, what an honor," gushed Lady Pemberton, a prominent philanthropist whose family had supported the hospital for 3 generations. "The work you've done to raise awareness for children's mental health has been absolutely transformational." Catherine smiled warmly, her training allowing her to respond with genuine gratitude while maintaining the appropriate distance. The real heroes are the medical staff and families who face these challenges every day. We're simply here to support their incredible work. It was the kind of response that had been crafted through years of media training and public appearances, heartfelt yet measured, personal yet appropriately detached. Catherine had learned to speak from the heart, while never revealing too much of it, to connect with people while maintaining the mystique that the monarchy required. As the evening progressed, she found herself genuinely enjoying several conversations. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the hospital's chief pediatric oncologist, shared stories of recent breakthroughs in treatment that filled Catherine with hope. A young nurse named Emma spoke passionately about the new family support center that would be built with funds raised that evening. Even the mandatory conversation with Lord Harrison, the hospital's rather pompous board chairman, had gone better than expected when he actually listened to her suggestions about expanding mental health services. But it was during the dinner service that Catherine first noticed her. Seated at a table near the back of the ballroom was a woman who seemed somehow separate from the glittering crowd around her. While other guests chatted animatedly over their smoked salmon appetizers, this woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on something far beyond the opulent surroundings. Catherine's attention was drawn to her several times throughout the meal. There is something about the woman's stillness that stood out in sharp contrast to the animated conversations and gentle laughter that filled the room. She was perhaps in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style, and wearing a black dress that, while elegant, seemed to carry a weight beyond fashion. "Who is that woman at table 12? Catherine discreetly asked her equerry, James Whitmore, during a brief pause between courses. James glanced over subtly before consulting his tablet. "Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, Your Royal Highness. She's here as a guest of the Carmichael Foundation. Lost her daughter to leukemia last year. The hospital tried everything they could." The information hit Catherine with unexpected force. She had attended dozens of charity events where she had met bereaved parents, and she had learned to compartmentalize the emotional impact of their stories in order to function effectively in her role. But something about Mrs. Davidson's quiet dignity, her presence at an event that must have been extraordinarily difficult for her, touched something deeper. As the main course was served and speeches began, Catherine found her gaze returning repeatedly to table 12. Mrs. Davidson listened politely to the presentations about the hospital's achievements and future plans, but her expression never changed. When other guests applauded the announcement of record-breaking fundraising numbers, she participated with the same quiet composure, but Catherine noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she brought them together. The evening's program continued with its carefully orchestrated schedule. Catherine presented the annual award to Dr. Matthews, acknowledging her groundbreaking research in pediatric care with words that had been written by her communications team, but delivered with genuine admiration. She participated in the charity auction, bidding appropriately on a few select items that would generate positive publicity without appearing excessive. Throughout it all, however, her attention kept drifting back to Eleanor Davidson. There was something about the woman's solitary grief that seemed to demand recognition, even though Catherine knew that approaching her would be a deviation for protocol. Her schedule for the evening was fully planned, and personal conversations with guests, particularly those dealing with tragedy, were generally discouraged unless they occurred naturally within the structured interactions. As the evening moved toward its conclusion, Catherine participated in the traditional receiving line, where major donors and VIPs had the opportunity for brief personal conversations. She listened to their expressions of support for the monarchy, their compliments on her work, and their requests for continued royal patronage of various causes. Each interaction was pleasant and productive, following the familiar patterns that had been refined through years of experience. But even as she smiled and nodded and offered appropriate responses, Catherine's mind remained partially focused on the quiet woman who seemed to carry her grief like a visible weight. She wondered about Eleanor's daughter, what she had been like, how long her illness had lasted, what her final days had been like. These were thoughts that her training had taught her to acknowledge but not dwell upon, as the emotional toll of too much empathy could compromise her ability to fulfill her duties effectively. The evening was drawing to a close when Catherine noticed Mrs. Davidson rising from her table and making her way slowly toward the exit. She moved with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the evening, but there was something final about her departure, as if she were leaving more than just a charity gala behind. Without fully conscious thought, Catherine excused herself from her current conversation with a visiting ambassador and began to make her way across the ballroom. Her movement caused a subtle stir among the remaining guests, as any deviation from expected royal behavior typically did, but she pressed on with growing determination. She was halfway across the room when she felt a gentle but firm touch on her arm. Turning, she found James at her side, his expression carefully neutral but his message clear. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, "the car is waiting. We should begin making our farewells to the hosts." Catherine paused, looking back toward where Mrs. Davidson was now speaking with someone near the coat check. The woman's posture suggested she was making polite conversation rather than seeking to leave quickly, which meant there might still be time for a brief interaction. "Of course," Catherine replied, but she made no move toward the exit. Instead, she remained where she was, torn between the comfortable predictability of protocol and the growing conviction that some connections transcended royal scheduling. The moment stretched between duty and compassion, between the role she had learned to play so well and the person she remained underneath the titles and expectations. Around them, the gala continued its elegant wind down, guests finishing final conversations and beginning their own departures, unaware that the Princess of Wales was facing a choice that would challenge everything she had been taught about the proper balance between royal responsibility and human empathy. James waited patiently beside her, understanding that moments like these required delicate handling. He had served the royal family long enough to recognize when duty and conscience were at odds, and he had learned to provide guidance without overstepping his role. "There would be time for a brief conversation," he said quietly, his words offering permission while reminding her the constraints they operated within. Catherine looked at him gratefully, appreciating both his understanding and his discretion. She had often found herself navigating these moments where her heart pulled her in one direction while protocol suggested another, and having staff members who could help her find appropriate compromises was invaluable. She made her decision and began moving again toward Mrs. Davidson, each step taking her further from the safety of established routine and closer to an interaction that could not be scripted or controlled. Behind her, she was dimly aware of the subtle reshuffling that always occurred when she deviated from planned activities. Her protection officers adjusting their positions, other staff members preparing for potential complications, the ever-present awareness that even the smallest royal actions had consequences beyond their immediate moment. But as she approached Eleanor Davidson, Catherine found herself less concerned with those broader implications than with the simple human recognition that had been growing throughout the evening. Sometimes she thought the crown had to serve compassion rather than the other way around. As Catherine approached Eleanor Davidson, she noticed the woman's companion, a younger man who bore a striking resemblance to her, likely a son. He was speaking quietly to his mother, his hand resting gently on her shoulder in a gesture of support that spoke of shared grief and mutual care. When he noticed the Princess of Wales approaching, his eyes widened with surprise, and he whispered something to Eleanor, who turned slowly to face Catherine. Up close, Eleanor's composure was even more remarkable. Her eyes, though clearly marked by loss, held a strength that Catherine found deeply moving. There was no trace of the starstruck nervousness that typically characterized interactions with members of the royal family. Instead, Eleanor regarded Catherine with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced life's ultimate test and emerged with her grace intact. "Mrs. Davidson," Catherine said softly, extending her hand. "I'm Catherine. I wanted to have the opportunity to speak with you this evening." Eleanor's handshake was firm and warm, and when she spoke, her voice carried the slight rasp of someone who had cried many tears but had found her way back to speaking clearly. "Your Royal Highness, it's an honor to meet you. This is my son, David." David stepped forward with obvious nervousness, offering a respectful bow before shaking Catherine's hand. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for approaching us. It means more than you know." Catherine could see the family resemblance clearly now. Both mother and son shared the same thoughtful eyes and quiet strength. But where Eleanor's grief was worn like a familiar coat, David's emotion seemed closer to the surface, as if he were still learning how to navigate a world without his sister. "I understand you lost your daughter," Catherine said gently. "I cannot imagine how difficult this evening must have been for you, being surrounded by discussions of the very place where you fought so hard for her life." Eleanor's composure wavered slightly, but she maintained her dignity. Sophie was 15 when she died. She spent the last 8 months of her life at the hospital, and the staff there became like family to us. When the Carmichael Foundation invited us tonight, I felt I needed to come to honor her memory and the people who cared for her with such dedication. The mention of Sophie's name seemed to unlock something in both Eleanor and David. David's eyes filled with tears that he tried discreetly to wipe away, while Eleanor's voice took on a different quality, warmer, more animated, as if speaking her daughter's name had brought back not just grief but also love. She would have been fascinated by all this, David added, gesturing toward the elegant ballroom around them. Sophie loved beautiful things, fashion, music, art. Even during her treatments, she would spend hours sketching dress designs or writing little stories about royal balls and adventures. Catherine felt her heart tighten as she imagined a young girl finding beauty and dreams even while battling for her life. She sounds like she was a remarkable young woman, creative and spirited. She was, Eleanor said, and for the first time that evening, a genuine smile crossed her face. The nurses used to say that Sophie could light up the entire pediatric ward just by walking down the hallway. Even when she was feeling terrible from the chemotherapy, she would make jokes or start impromptu fashion shows with her hospital gowns. As they spoke, Catherine became aware that their conversation was drawing subtle attention from other guests. Several people had positioned themselves nearby, clearly hoping to overhear the interaction, and she noticed photographers in the distance adjusting their positions to potentially capture the moment. The awareness of being watched was a constant in her life, but rarely did it feel as intrusive as it did now, when she was engaged in a conversation that felt deeply personal and meaningful. "Would you like to step somewhere a bit more private?" Catherine suggested, noticing Eleanor's slight discomfort with the attention they were receiving. "Perhaps we could continue our conversation in the quiet room, just off the main ballroom." Eleanor looked surprised by the offer. "Oh, Your Royal Highness, I wouldn't want to impose on your time. I'm sure you have many other people to see." Catherine glanced back toward where James was waiting with the other members of her team. She could see the subtle tension in their postures. They were clearly aware that this unplanned interaction was extending beyond the typical parameters, but they were also experienced enough to recognize that sometimes the most meaningful royal engagements were the ones that departed from script. "The most important conversations often happen when we least expect them," Catherine replied, "and I find myself very interested in hearing more about Sophie and your experience with the hospital." David looked at his mother with obvious emotion. "Mom, Sophie would have wanted you to talk about her. She always said that her story might help other families." Eleanor considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're certain we wouldn't be keeping you from other obligations, I would be honored to share more about her." Catherine led them toward the smaller reception room that was typically used for more intimate conversations during charity events. As they walked, she was acutely aware of the curious glances from other guests and the subtle repositioning of her security detail to accommodate the change in plans. But she was also conscious of something else, a sense of rightness about this interaction that transcended the usual calculations of royal duty and public benefit. The smaller room was elegantly appointed, but much quieter, with comfortable seating arranged around a warm fireplace. Catherine gestured for Eleanor and David to take seats on a small sofa while she chose a chair nearby, close enough for intimate conversation, but positioned in a way that maintained appropriate respect for their grief. "Tell me about Sophie's time at the hospital," Catherine said once they were settled. "What was that experience like for your family?" Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "When Sophie was first diagnosed, we were terrified. The word leukemia seemed to stop the world. But from the moment we walked into the pediatric wing, the staff there made us feel like we weren't facing this alone." She described the months of treatment with both heartbreaking detail and surprising warmth. Sophie had responded well initially, and there had been periods of hope where normal life seemed possible again. She had continued her education with tutors provided by the hospital, and her room had been filled with art supplies and books that allowed her to pursue her creative interests even during the most difficult treatments. Dr. Matthews was wonderful, Eleanor continued. She never talked down to Sophie, always explained what was happening in terms she could understand. And she was honest when things started to go wrong. She prepared us without taking away hope. David added his own memories of visiting his sister, describing elaborate games they would play in her hospital room, and the way Sophie would insist on doing his makeup when she was too weak for other activities. She turned her illness into this adventure, he said with a mixture of pride and grief. Right up until the end, she was planning things, what she wanted to study when she got better, places she wanted to travel, boys she thought were cute. Catherine listened with complete attention, occasionally asking gentle questions that encouraged them to share more memories. She found herself deeply moved not only by their loss, but by the picture that emerged of Sophie, a young woman who had faced terminal illness with creativity, humor, and an irrepressible spirit. The night before she died, Eleanor said, her voice becoming quieter, "Sophie made me promise her something. She said she wanted her story to help other families, and she wanted the hospital to continue getting support so that other children could have the same quality of care she had received." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of that promise settled between them. Catherine could see that this evening's gala was part of Eleanor's effort to honor her daughter's final wish, which made her presence all the more poignant. "How are you managing to fulfill that promise?" Catherine asked gently. David answered first. "Mom has been incredible. She's been volunteering with family support services at the hospital, helping other parents navigate what we went through. And she's been working with the Carmichael Foundation to establish a fund specifically for creative therapy programs." Eleanor's eyes brightened slightly. Sophie believed that art and creativity were essential parts of healing, not just extras. The fund is meant to ensure that children at the hospital always have access to music therapy, art classes, creative writing programs, the things that help them remember they're more than just their illness. Catherine felt a surge of admiration for this woman who had transformed her personal tragedy into a force for helping others. It was exactly the kind of approach that resonated with her own beliefs about the power of service to help process grief and create meaning from loss. "That's extraordinary," Catherine said with genuine feeling. Sophie's legacy is clearly in excellent hands. As they continued talking, Catherine learned more about the challenges facing families dealing with pediatric illness. Eleanor spoke about the financial strain that even insured families faced, the emotional toll on siblings like David, and the long-term impacts that extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis. She described gaps in support services and areas where additional funding could make significant differences in family experiences. What struck Catherine most was Eleanor's complete lack of bitterness or self-pity. Despite having lived through every parent's worst nightmare, she spoke about their experience with gratitude for the care Sophie had received and determination to help others benefit from similar support. "The hospital becomes your second home," Eleanor explained. "The staff become family. When you're there for months, you see how much difference small things can make. Having comfortable sleeping arrangements for parents, access to healthy food, spaces where families can have private conversations. These things matter enormously when you're living through crisis." Catherine found herself taking mental notes, thinking about how these insights might inform future royal patronage decisions and charitable initiatives. But more than that, she was simply moved by the human story unfolding before her, a story of love, loss, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. The conversation was interrupted when James appeared quietly in the doorway, his expression apologetic but firm. Catherine knew that look. It meant that her schedule had been stretched to its absolute limits, and that further delay would create complications for the rest of her evening obligations. "I'm so sorry," Catherine said to Eleanor and David, "but I'm afraid I need to begin making my departure. However, I wonder if we might continue this conversation at a future time. I would very much like to learn more about the work you're doing and how the Royal Foundation might potentially support Sophie's fund." Eleanor looked stunned. Your Royal Highness, that would be... I never imagined. Yes, of course, we would be honored. Catherine rose from her chair, prompting Eleanor and David to stand as well. As they prepared to part ways, she felt a reluctance to end the conversation that surprised her with its intensity. These unscripted moments of genuine human connection had become increasingly rare in her life, and this particular exchange had touched something deep in her understanding of what royal service could and should accomplish. "Before I go," Catherine said, reaching into her small evening bag, "I wonder if you would accept my personal card. I would like my private secretary to arrange a proper meeting where we can discuss how to honor Sophie's memory most effectively." Eleanor accepted the card with shaking hands, clearly overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness." This would have meant everything to Sophie. As they exchanged final pleasantries, and Catherine prepared to leave, she was conscious of having crossed some invisible line during their conversation. She had moved beyond the role of gracious royal patron offering sympathy and entered into something more personal and committed. It was exactly the kind of spontaneous engagement that her training had taught her to approach cautiously, but it felt utterly right. The walk back through the main ballroom toward her departure felt different now, charged with new purpose and possibility. Catherine smiled and nodded to the guests she passed, but her mind was already working on how to follow through on the commitment she had just made to Eleanor and David, and by extension, to Sophie's memory. 3 weeks later, Catherine sat in her private office at Kensington Palace, surrounded by briefing papers about upcoming engagements and correspondence that required her personal attention. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating stacks of documents that represented the careful choreography of royal life, each event planned months in advance, every detail scrutinized for its potential impact on the monarchy's reputation and public service mission. Eleanor Davidson's personal card sat prominently on her desk, a reminder of the conversation that had lingered in Catherine's thoughts since the charity gala. She had asked her private secretary to research the Sophie Davidson Creative Therapy Fund, and the resulting report had only deepened her admiration for what Eleanor was attempting to accomplish. The fund was ambitious in scope, but desperately underfunded, existing mainly as a vision rather than a functioning program. Catherine had requested this morning meeting specifically to discuss how the Royal Foundation might support Eleanor's work. She believed it represented exactly the kind of meaningful, family-focused charitable initiative that aligned with her own priorities and could make a genuine difference in children's lives. What she had not anticipated was the resistance she would encounter from her own team. "Your Royal Highness, with the greatest respect," began Sir Anthony Hartwell, the Foundation's chairman and a man whose understanding of royal protocol had been refined through decades of service to the crown. "While Mrs. Davidson's story is undoubtedly moving, we must consider the broader implications of establishing a formal partnership with her fund." Catherine looked up from the briefing papers, surprised by the cautious tone of the conversation. She had expected discussion about implementation details and funding mechanisms, not questions about whether the partnership should proceed at all. "What implications concern you, Anthony?" she asked, setting down her pen and giving him her full attention. Sir Anthony exchanged glances with Margaret Thornton, Catherine's chief of staff, before continuing. "The Sophie Davidson Fund, while well-intentioned, lacks the institutional stability that we typically require for royal patronage. Mrs. Davidson has no background in charity management. The fund has no established board of trustees, and there are no mechanisms in place for financial oversight or program evaluation." Margaret nodded in agreement, consulting her tablet as she spoke. "Additionally, Your Royal Highness, we've identified several concerns about precedent. If we begin supporting individual families' memorial funds, we could find ourselves inundated with similar requests. There are protocols in place for royal charitable involvement precisely to prevent the Foundation from becoming overwhelmed with well-meaning, but administratively challenging initiatives." Catherine felt a familiar tension rising, the same feeling she had experienced at the gala when duty and compassion had pulled her in different directions. She understood the practical concerns being raised, but she also remembered Eleanor's quiet dignity and the powerful vision behind Sophie's final wishes. "Surely there are ways to address these administrative challenges," Catherine replied. "We could work with Mrs. Davidson to develop proper oversight structures, perhaps partner with an established charity that could provide the necessary framework for managing funds and programs." James Whitmore, who had been quietly observing the discussion, leaned forward slightly. "Your Royal Highness, there's another consideration that might be relevant. Our research has uncovered some potential complications regarding Mrs. Davidson's interactions with hospital staff during her daughter's treatment." Catherine's attention sharpened. "What kind of complications?" "It appears that Mrs. Davidson had several disagreements with hospital administration about visiting policies and treatment decisions. Nothing inappropriate, of course, but she developed a reputation as someone who challenged established procedures when she felt they weren't serving her daughter's best interests." Margaret added, "There are documented instances of her bypassing normal channels to access senior medical staff directly, and she apparently organized other families to petition for changes in hospital policies regarding family accommodations and creative therapy programs." Catherine considered this information carefully. Rather than seeing Eleanor's actions as problematic, she found herself admiring the woman even more. The picture that emerged was of a mother who had advocated fearlessly for her daughter and had worked to improve conditions for other families facing similar challenges. Those sound like the actions of a woman who cared deeply about her daughter's welfare and saw opportunities to improve the system for everyone, Catherine observed. "I'm not sure why that would be considered a negative factor." Sir Anthony's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but Catherine could sense his growing discomfort with the direction of the conversation. "Your Royal Highness, the concern is not about Mrs. Davidson's motivations, which were undoubtedly admirable. Rather, it's about the potential for controversy if the Royal Foundation becomes associated with someone who has a history of challenging institutional authority." The room fell silent for a moment as Catherine processed this concern. She was acutely aware of the delicate balance that royal charitable work required, supporting meaningful causes while avoiding anything that might be perceived as political interference or institutional criticism. At the same time, she felt strongly that effective charity work sometimes required challenging existing systems to create positive change. Has Mrs. Davidson expressed any intention to use royal support as a platform for criticizing the hospital or advocating for specific policy changes? Catherine asked. "Not explicitly," Margaret replied, "but our assessment suggests that someone with her background might view royal endorsement as validation for a more activist approach to healthcare advocacy. That could create uncomfortable situations where the Crown appears to be taking sides in medical or policy debates." Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the carefully maintained gardens that surrounded Kensington Palace. The view reminded her of the careful cultivation required for royal work. Every element planned and tended to create an appearance of natural beauty that actually required enormous behind-the-scenes effort. "I need to understand something," she said, turning back to face her team. "Are you suggesting that we should avoid supporting Mrs. Davidson's fund because she might be too effective an advocate for the families it would serve?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the fundamental tension at the heart of their discussion. Sir Anthony cleared his throat carefully. "Your Royal Highness, the concern is about maintaining the careful neutrality that allows royal charitable work to be effective across party lines and institutional boundaries. When the Crown supports a charity, that organization receives enormous credibility and public attention. With that platform comes the responsibility to work within established systems rather than challenging them." Catherine felt a surge of frustration that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent years learning to navigate these complex considerations, understanding that royal support could be as much burden as blessing for charitable organizations. But in this case, the careful neutrality being advocated seemed to prioritize institutional comfort over the welfare of families facing pediatric illness. "What if we structured the partnership differently?" she suggested, returning to her seat. Instead of directly supporting Mrs. Davidson's fund, what if we worked with the hospital itself to establish a creative therapy program that could be funded through existing charitable channels? James consulted his notes. We explore that option, Your Royal Highness. The hospital administration expressed enthusiasm about royal involvement in general, but seemed hesitant to specifically endorse the creative therapy approach that Mrs. Davidson advocates. They prefer programs with more established clinical evidence and standardized implementation protocols, Margaret added. There's also the question of whether circumventing Mrs. Davidson's direct involvement might undermine the very connection that motivated Your Royal Highness's interest in this initiative. Catherine realized that her team had clearly done thorough research and had identified legitimate challenges that required serious consideration. But she also felt that their analysis was missing something essential, the human element that had made her conversation with Eleanor so compelling and meaningful. I want to schedule a meeting with Mrs. Davidson, Catherine said decisively. Before we make any final decisions about how to proceed, I need to understand her perspective on these concerns and explore what approaches might work best for everyone involved. Sir Anthony's expression suggested he had expected this request, but hoped to avoid it. Your Royal Highness, if you're determined to meet with Mrs. Davidson again, we should establish clear parameters for the conversation. It would be important to avoid raising expectations about royal support until we've resolved these fundamental questions about structure and approach. Of course, Catherine agreed. But I also don't want to approach the conversation from a purely defensive position. Mrs. Davidson deserves to know that we're genuinely interested in finding ways to support her daughter's legacy, even if the specific mechanisms require careful consideration. Margaret made notes on her tablet. I'll coordinate with Mrs. Davidson's schedule and arrange a suitable venue for the meeting. Should we plan for a formal session with full briefing materials, or would Your Royal Highness prefer a more informal conversation? Catherine thought about her previous interaction with Eleanor, remembering the woman's authenticity and the way their conversation had developed organically from polite formality into genuine connection. She felt strongly that the follow-up meeting should preserve that spirit while addressing the legitimate practical concerns her team had raised. Let's arrange something that feels personal but professional, she decided. Perhaps a private meeting here at Kensington Palace, with just Mrs. Davidson and myself initially, followed by a broader conversation that includes relevant staff members from both sides. As her team continued discussing logistical details, Catherine found herself thinking about the larger questions that Eleanor's situation represented. Royal charitable work had always required balancing multiple competing interests, supporting meaningful causes while maintaining institutional neutrality, helping individual families while establishing sustainable systems, responding to immediate needs while building long-term solutions. But Eleanor's story had highlighted something that Catherine felt was sometimes lost in these careful calculations: the power of personal connection and authentic human response to motivate lasting change. The protocols and procedures that her team valued so highly serve important purposes, but they could also become barriers to the very connections that made charitable work meaningful and effective. There's one more thing I want to explore, Catherine said as the meeting began to wind down. I'd like to research other situations where members of the royal family have supported charitable initiatives that initially faced similar concerns about structure or controversy. I suspect we might find precedents that could guide our approach here. Sir Anthony nodded thoughtfully. That's an excellent suggestion, Your Royal Highness. Historical perspective might indeed reveal approaches that we haven't considered. As her staff prepared to leave, Catherine remained seated at her desk, looking again at Eleanor's card and thinking about the conversation that lay ahead. She felt confident that there were solutions to be found, ways to honor Sophie's memory while addressing the legitimate concerns about sustainability and appropriate royal involvement. What she needed to determine was whether Eleanor would be willing to work within the constraints that royal support would require, and whether those constraints would ultimately serve or undermine the vision that had inspired Sophie's final wishes. The meeting would be crucial not just for deciding about this specific partnership, but for clarifying Catherine's own understanding of how royal charitable work could most effectively serve both institutional needs and human compassion. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting new patterns of light across her office as Catherine finally set Eleanor's card aside and turned to the next items requiring her attention. But even as she moved on to other responsibilities, she found herself looking forward to the upcoming conversation with anticipation rather than apprehension, sensing that it would clarify important questions about the role she wanted to play in making meaningful change possible. The private drawing room at Kensington Palace had been carefully prepared for Catherine's meeting with Eleanor Davidson. Fresh flowers from the palace gardens graced a side table, and afternoon tea was set for two, creating an atmosphere that balanced royal formality with personal warmth. Catherine had chosen this room specifically because it felt more intimate than her formal office, while still maintaining the dignity appropriate for discussing serious charitable matters. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, accompanied by David, who had asked to join the meeting to provide moral support for his mother. Catherine had agreed to his inclusion, sensing that their shared grief and determination to honor Sophie's memory made them effective partners in their advocacy efforts. Mrs. Davidson, David, thank you for coming, Catherine said as she welcomed them into the room. Please, make yourselves comfortable. I thought we might begin with tea and then discuss how we can best move forward with supporting Sophie's legacy. Eleanor seemed more relaxed than she had at the charity gala, though Catherine could still sense the underlying tension that accompanied discussions of her daughter's memory. David appeared nervous, but determined, clearly prepared to support his mother through what they both understood could be a pivotal conversation for their charitable goals. As they settled into comfortable chairs arranged around a low table, Catherine noticed that Eleanor had brought a leather portfolio with her. When she mentioned it, Eleanor's expression brightened with obvious pride. These are some of Sophie's designs and writings, Eleanor explained, carefully removing several items from the portfolio. I thought you might like to see the creative work that inspired her vision for the therapy program. Catherine accepted the materials with genuine interest, immediately struck by their quality and sophistication. Sophie's fashion sketches showed remarkable talent for someone so young, with detailed attention to fabric choices and construction techniques that suggested serious artistic training. Her writing samples were equally impressive, short stories and poetry that dealt with themes of hope, beauty, and resilience with surprising maturity. These are extraordinary, Catherine said with complete sincerity. Sophie clearly had exceptional gifts. I can understand why creative expression was so important to her and why she wanted other children to have access to similar opportunities. David leaned forward eagerly. That's exactly what Mum has been trying to explain to everyone. Sophie didn't want art therapy to be some kind of distraction from medical treatment. She saw creativity as an essential part of healing, something that helped her maintain her sense of self even when everything else in her life was being controlled by the illness. Eleanor nodded, her voice becoming more animated as she spoke about her daughter's vision. Sophie used to say that when she was drawing or writing, she felt like herself again, not just a patient. She believed that every child facing serious illness deserved to have that same experience, the chance to create something beautiful and meaningful regardless of what their bodies were going through. Catherine could see the passion behind Eleanor's advocacy, the way her personal grief had been transformed into a determination to help others. But she also knew that the conversation needed to address the concerns that her staff had raised about sustainability and institutional relationships. Eleanor, I want you to know that I share your commitment to making Sophie's vision a reality, Catherine began carefully. At the same time, my team has raised some important questions about how to structure a partnership in a way that would be most effective for everyone involved. I'd like to discuss those concerns openly with you. Eleanor straightened slightly, clearly preparing herself for challenging topics. Of course, Your Royal Highness. I understand that royal support comes with responsibilities and requirements that I may not fully appreciate. Catherine appreciated Eleanor's directness and her willingness to engage with difficult questions. One of the primary concerns is about the administrative structure needed to manage a charitable fund effectively. My staff noted that you don't currently have experience in charity management or established systems for financial oversight and program evaluation. That's absolutely true, Eleanor replied without defensiveness. When I started the fund, I was focused entirely on honoring Sophie's wishes and trying to help other families. I didn't think through all the administrative requirements that would be necessary for scaling up the program. David added, but Mom has been learning quickly. She's been working with a consultant from the Carmichael Foundation to understand best practices for charity management, and we've been researching how other memorial funds have addressed similar challenges. Catherine was impressed by their practical approach to addressing legitimate concerns. What solutions have you identified? Eleanor consulted a notebook she had brought with her. We've explored several options for creating proper oversight structures. One possibility would be to establish the Sophie Davidson Fund as a subsidiary program under an existing, established charity that already has the administrative infrastructure we lack. Another option would be to partner directly with a hospital to implement creative therapy programs as part of their existing family support services. Those sound like promising approaches, Catherine said. Which option do you think would best serve Sophie's vision? Eleanor paused, clearly weighing her response carefully. Honestly, Your Royal Highness, I think the hospital partnership would be most effective in terms of directly serving children and families. But I also have concerns about whether the hospital administration fully understands or supports the kind of creative therapy program that Sophie envisioned. Catherine sensed they were approaching the more sensitive territory that her staff had warned her about. Can you tell me more about those concerns? David and Eleanor exchanged glances before Eleanor continued. During Sophie's treatment, I observed gaps between what the medical staff believed would be helpful for patients and families and what actually made a difference in our daily experience. The hospital tends to prefer programs that have been extensively studied and validated through clinical trials, which makes sense from a medical perspective. But Sophie's needs were more immediate and personal. Can you give me a specific example? Catherine asked. Sophie desperately wanted to continue her art classes even while she was receiving intensive chemotherapy, Eleanor explained. The hospital had a recreational therapy program, but it was very basic, coloring books and simple crafts designed for much younger children. When I asked if Sophie could work with more advanced materials and techniques, I was told that the insurance liability and infection control requirements made it too complicated to accommodate. David picked up the story. So Mom basically created an unofficial art program in Sophie's room. She brought in professional quality supplies, arranged for a private art teacher to visit during approved hours, and worked with the nursing staff to establish safety protocols that met both Sophie's creative needs and the hospital's medical requirements. Catherine could see both sides of this situation clearly. The hospital's caution about liability and medical safety made perfect sense from an institutional perspective, but Eleanor's determination to meet her daughter's specific needs had led to a more personalized solution that had apparently worked well for everyone involved. How did the hospital staff respond to your initiative? Catherine asked. Eleanor smiled for the first time since they had begun discussing these sensitive topics. Actually, many of the nurses and doctors were very supportive once they saw how much the advanced art program helped Sophie's mood and overall well-being. Several other families asked if their children could participate, and by the time Sophie died, we had created an informal network of families sharing resources and supporting each other's efforts to maintain creative programming. But the hospital administration never formally endorsed what you had created. Catherine pressed gently. No, Eleanor admitted. They appreciated the positive impact, but they were reluctant to establish official policies based on what they saw as exceptional circumstances. Their position was that individual families were welcome to pursue additional activities as long as they didn't interfere with medical care, but that the hospital couldn't take responsibility for coordinating or supporting such programs. Catherine understood now why her staff had characterized Eleanor as someone who challenged institutional authority. But Rather than seeing this as problematic, Catherine found herself admiring Eleanor's ability to work within system constraints while still achieving outcomes that serve her daughter's needs. So, when you established the Sophie Davidson Fund, Catherine continued, you were essentially trying to formalize and expand the kind of creative programming that you had developed informally during Sophie's treatment. Exactly, Eleanor said with obvious relief at being understood. I want other families to have access to high-quality, creative therapy without having to navigate the complex negotiations that we went through. And I want hospital staff to have the resources and support they need to accommodate children's creative needs as part of standard care rather than as special exceptions. Catherine could see that Eleanor's goals were entirely reasonable and aligned with best practices in pediatric care. The challenge was finding a way to implement those goals that would satisfy both hospital administration's need for formal procedures and families' needs for personalized creative opportunities. Eleanor, I'm going to be completely honest with you about the concerns that have been raised, Catherine said, leaning forward slightly. Some members of my team worry that your history of challenging hospital procedures could lead to conflicts if royal support gives you a platform for criticizing current institutional practices. Eleanor's expression became more serious, but she didn't seem defensive. I understand that concern, and I appreciate your directness in raising it. The truth is that I do believe there are ways that pediatric care could be improved to better serve children's emotional and creative needs. But I also recognize that sustainable change requires working with institutions rather than against them. David added, what Mum learned during Sophie's treatment is that most healthcare providers genuinely want to help children and families thrive, but they often lack the resources and support systems needed to go beyond basic medical care. The Sophie Davidson Fund is meant to provide those resources, not to criticize hospitals for current limitations. Catherine felt a sense of clarity beginning to emerge from their conversation. Eleanor's advocacy was grounded in experience and focused on solutions rather than complaints. Her approach seemed both pragmatic and visionary in ways that could complement rather than conflict with royal charitable work. What if we structured a partnership that allowed you to work directly with hospital staff to develop and implement creative therapy programs, with Royal Foundation support providing the credibility and resources needed to make those programs sustainable? Catherine suggested. Eleanor's eyes lit up with obvious excitement. That would be perfect. It would honor Sophie's vision while addressing the institutional concerns about sustainability and oversight. And it would ensure that the programs developed would meet both medical requirements and children's creative needs. As they continued discussing potential implementation strategies, Catherine felt increasingly confident that the concerns raised by her staff, while legitimate, were not insurmountable obstacles. Eleanor's experience and passion, combined with appropriate support and structure, could create exactly the kind of innovative charitable program that royal patronage was designed to enable. The conversation was interrupted when Margaret Thornton appeared in the doorway, clearly reluctant to disturb the meeting, but needing to address some urgent matter. I'm so sorry to interrupt, Your Royal Highness, Margaret said, but there's been a development that I think you should know about immediately. Catherine excused herself from Eleanor and David, stepping aside with Margaret to hear what had arisen. We've just received word that someone has leaked information about Your Royal Highness's interest in Mrs. Davidson's fund to the press, Margaret said quietly. The story is expected to run in tomorrow's papers, and the angle appears to be that royal support is being considered for a charity run by a woman who has a history of conflicts with hospital administration. Catherine felt her stomach tighten as she realized that their careful deliberations about how to proceed had been overtaken by events beyond their control. The conversation she had been having with Eleanor had felt positive and productive, but now they would all be forced to respond to public scrutiny before they had reached any conclusions about the best path forward. The early morning light had barely begun to filter through the windows of Kensington Palace when Catherine arrived at her office, determined to address the crisis that had erupted overnight. The newspaper headlines had been even worse than Margaret's warning had suggested, with several major publications running stories that portrayed her potential support for Eleanor Davidson's fund as evidence of poor judgment and inadequate vetting procedures. Royal backing for troublemaker read one particularly inflammatory headline, while another asked, "Is the princess too trusting?" The articles painted Eleanor as a difficult woman who had caused problems for hospital staff and was now using her daughter's tragic death to gain access to royal patronage for her personal agenda. Catherine felt a surge of protective anger as she read the coverage. The Eleanor Davidson portrayed in these stories bore no resemblance to the dignified, passionate woman she had come to know through their conversations. The press had taken Eleanor's legitimate advocacy for her daughter and twisted it into evidence of problematic behavior, while completely ignoring the innovative solutions she had developed and the positive outcomes she had achieved. The phones have been ringing constantly since 5 in the morning, Margaret reported as she joined Catherine in reviewing the coverage. Hospital administrators, charity officials, and members of Parliament are all calling to offer their perspectives on Mrs. Davidson and her fund. Some support her work, but others are expressing concerns about royal association with someone they characterize as difficult to work with. Sir Anthony arrived with additional briefing materials, his expression grim as he surveyed the situation. "Your Royal Highness, we're facing exactly the kind of controversy that our vetting procedures are designed to prevent. The press coverage has created a narrative that will be very difficult to overcome, regardless of the actual merits of Mrs. Davidson's charitable work." Catherine set down the newspapers and looked steadily at her senior staff members. "Before we discuss response strategies, I want to be very clear about something. Based on my conversations with Mrs. Davidson, I believe the press coverage represents a fundamental mischaracterization of both her motivations and her actions. She is a grieving mother who developed innovative solutions to real problems in pediatric care, and she has been working to share those solutions with other families facing similar challenges." Margaret nodded diplomatically. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. The question is whether we can effectively communicate that perspective given the narrative that has now been established in the public discourse. What responses are we receiving from the hospital and other charitable organizations?" Catherine asked. Sir Anthony consulted his notes. "Dr. Matthews from the hospital has issued a statement supporting Mrs. Davidson's contributions to patient care and family support during her daughter's treatment. Several nurses have also spoken positively about her involvement. However, hospital administration has been more circumspect, noting that they appreciate family advocacy while emphasizing their commitment to established procedures and protocols." Catherine felt encouraged by the support from medical staff who had worked directly with Eleanor and Sophie. Their perspective carried significant credibility and suggested that the press narrative was indeed unfair and incomplete. "Have we heard from Mrs. Davidson herself this morning?" Catherine inquired. Margaret checked her tablet. "She called about 30 minutes ago, Your Royal Highness. She was clearly distressed by the coverage and offered to withdraw her request for royal support in order to avoid further controversy. She said she never intended for her daughter's memory to become the subject of negative publicity for the royal family." Catherine felt her heart go out to Eleanor, imagining how devastating it must be to see Sophie's legacy caught up in media controversy. The offer to withdraw demonstrated exactly the kind of selflessness and concern for others that had characterized all of Eleanor's actions since her daughter's death. "I want to speak with Mrs. Davidson personally," Catherine decided. "Before we finalize any response strategy, I need to understand her perspective on this situation and assure her that we're not abandoning our support because of unfair press coverage." As Margaret arranged the call, Catherine found herself reflecting on the broader questions raised by this crisis. The media attention had forced her to confront fundamental issues about the purpose and limitations of royal charitable work. Should potential for controversy automatically disqualify worthy causes from receiving support? How could the monarchy balance institutional caution with meaningful engagement on challenging social issues? Eleanor's voice, when the call connected, carried obvious strain but maintained the dignity that Catherine had come to associate with her. Your Royal Highness, I am so sorry that my situation has created difficulties for you. That was never my intention. Eleanor, please don't apologize, Catherine replied firmly. You have done nothing wrong, and I will not allow unfair press coverage to dictate our decisions about supporting meaningful charitable work. Sophie's vision deserves better than to be abandoned because of media sensationalism. There was a long pause before Eleanor responded, and when she spoke, Catherine could hear tears in her voice. Thank you, Your Royal Highness. This morning has been very difficult. Seeing Sophie's memory caught up in controversy, reading suggestions that I used her death for personal gain. It's been heartbreaking. The people who know your work understand the truth, Catherine assured her. Dr. Matthews and the nursing staff have spoken publicly about your positive contributions. The families you've helped through the informal support network you created know the difference you've made in their lives. Don't let the press narrative overshadow the reality of what you've accomplished. Eleanor's voice became stronger as they talked. What should I do about the fund, Your Royal Highness? I don't want Sophie's legacy to become a source of continuing controversy, but I also don't want to give up on the vision she asked me to pursue. Catherine had been thinking about this question since reading the morning's coverage, and she felt increasingly clear about the path forward. Eleanor, I believe there's a way to move ahead that addresses the legitimate concerns while still honoring Sophie's wishes. But it will require some adjustments to our original approach. I'm willing to consider any modifications that would make the partnership workable, Eleanor replied immediately. Catherine outlined her thinking. What if we restructured the initiative to focus directly on evidence-based outcomes rather than on the fund itself? We could work with the hospital to develop a pilot creative therapy program, with your input and experience informing the design, but with the hospital taking the lead on implementation and evaluation. Eleanor sounded intrigued. That would address concerns about my role while still advancing Sophie's vision. The program could demonstrate the effectiveness of creative therapy, and if it succeeded, it could serve as a model for other hospitals. Exactly, Catherine confirmed. Royal support would go to the hospital's program rather than to your personal fund, which removes the questions about charity management experience. But your expertise and Sophie's story would still be central to developing approaches that really serve children and families. As they discussed implementation details, Catherine felt a sense of rightness about this modified approach. It preserved the essential elements that had attracted her to Eleanor's work while addressing the structural concerns that had been raised. More importantly, it offered a way to move forward despite the media controversy. There's one more element I'd like to add, Catherine continued. I think it would be valuable to create a formal advisory role for family advocates like yourself in the ongoing development of the program. That would ensure that the perspectives of families who have lived through pediatric illness continue to inform how services are designed and delivered. Eleanor's gratitude was evident in her voice. That would be wonderful, Your Royal Highness. It would mean that other parents wouldn't have to navigate the system alone the way we did, and it would give families a voice in improving care for everyone. After ending the call, Catherine turned to her staff with renewed energy for addressing the crisis. I want to schedule a press conference for this afternoon, she announced. We're going to address this controversy directly and announce our support for the hospital's new creative therapy pilot program. Sir Anthony looked concerned. Your Royal Highness, wouldn't it be wiser to let the story fade quietly rather than drawing additional attention to it? Catherine shook her head firmly. The story isn't going to fade, and silence will be interpreted as either guilt or abandonment of Mrs. Davidson. We need to control the narrative by demonstrating leadership and commitment to meaningful charitable work. Margaret began making notes about logistics and messaging. What key points should the press conference emphasize? First, that Mrs. Davidson is a dedicated advocate whose innovative approaches to family support have been validated by medical professionals who worked with her, Catherine replied. Second, that royal support is being provided to the hospital for an evidence-based pilot program that will benefit all families facing pediatric illness. And third, that effective charitable work sometimes requires partnering with advocates who challenge systems to make them better serve the people they're meant to help. Over the next several hours, Catherine's team worked intensively to prepare for the press conference and coordinate with hospital administration about the new partnership structure. Dr. Matthews proved to be a valuable ally, enthusiastically endorsing both the creative therapy approach and Eleanor's contributions to developing it. The press conference itself took place in the formal reception room at Kensington Palace, with Catherine flanked by Dr. Matthews and the hospital's chief executive, who had agreed to participate in order to demonstrate institutional support for the initiative. Eleanor had chosen not to attend, feeling that her presence might distract from the focus on the program itself, but Catherine made sure to acknowledge her contributions prominently in her remarks. Today, I am pleased to announce the Royal Foundation's support for an innovative pilot program in creative therapy for children facing serious illness, Catherine began, looking directly into the television cameras. This program represents the kind of evidence-based, family-centered approach to pediatric care that exemplifies the best of British medical innovation and compassion. She went on to describe Sophie's vision and Eleanor's advocacy, carefully framing their story in terms of positive contributions rather than institutional conflicts. She emphasized the collaborative approach that would guide the program's development and the potential for creating models that could benefit children throughout the healthcare system. Sometimes, Catherine concluded, meaningful progress requires working with advocates who care so deeply about improving outcomes that they're willing to challenge existing approaches and develop new solutions. Mrs. Davidson represents exactly the kind of family-centered advocacy that should inform how we design services for children and families facing medical crises. The question period that followed was challenging but manageable, with Catherine demonstrating both command of the details and passion for the underlying mission. Dr. Matthews provided medical credibility for the creative therapy approach, while the hospital executive assured reporters that the program would meet all standards for safety and effectiveness. In the days that followed, the media narrative gradually shifted from controversy to curiosity about the innovative program being developed. Eleanor found herself invited to speak at conferences about family advocacy in healthcare, and several other hospitals expressed interest in developing similar programs. 6 months later, Catherine attended the opening ceremony for the Sophie Davidson Creative Therapy Center at the Children's Hospital. The bright, welcoming space featured studios for art, music, and writing, staffed by trained therapists who worked closely with medical teams to integrate creative expression into comprehensive patient care. Eleanor was there, of course, wearing a pin featuring one of Sophie's original designs, and beaming with pride as children and families explored the new facilities. David had become a volunteer coordinator for the program, helping other siblings navigate the challenges of supporting family members through serious illness. You know, Eleanor said to Catherine during a quiet moment in the ceremony, Sophie would have loved this controversy. She always said that the best stories were the ones where people had to fight for what was right. Catherine smiled, watching children who were currently patients at the hospital working alongside healthy siblings and parents to create collaborative art projects that would be displayed throughout the pediatric wing. The site represented everything she had hoped to achieve through royal charitable work. Meaningful service that created lasting positive change while bringing people together across different circumstances and backgrounds. As she prepared to leave the ceremony, Catherine reflected on the lessons she had learned from her experience with Eleanor and the Sophie Davidson Fund. The most important charitable work often emerged from personal connections and human stories that couldn't be captured in briefing papers or risk assessments. While institutional caution served important purposes, it could also prevent the monarchy from supporting exactly the kind of innovative, family-centered initiatives that most needed royal credibility and resources. The evening news coverage of the center's opening focused on the children's artwork and the family's expressions of gratitude, with only brief mentions of the earlier controversy. Catherine felt satisfied that they had successfully navigated the crisis while preserving the essential vision that had motivated her initial interest in Eleanor's work. Later that evening, as she reviewed correspondence in her private office, Catherine found a handwritten note from Eleanor among the day's mail. It contained a simple thank you for believing in Sophie's vision and a promise to continue advocating for children and families with the same determination that had characterized her daughter's approach to life. Attached to the note was one of Sophie's original poems, written during her final weeks of treatment. It spoke of hope and beauty persisting even in the darkest circumstances, and of the responsibility that healthy people have to create opportunities for others to experience joy and creativity regardless of their physical limitations. Catherine carefully filed the poem in her personal correspondence folder, knowing that it would serve as a reminder of why the Crown's support for challenging but meaningful charitable work remained essential, regardless of the complications it might sometimes create. Sometimes, she realized, being a rule enforcer meant knowing when the most important rule was compassion.